The clay tablet came out of the ground in pieces, as most Sumerian tablets do. Archaeologists pieced the fragments together and read the cuneiform. The tablet was a map, but not of cities or rivers. The lines and markings pointed to 7 locations beneath the earth. Beside each location, the scribe had written a name: the one without rival, the blazing flame, the one who with terror crumbles, mountain melter, wind that seeks the rim of the world, the one who above and below no one spares, vaporizer of living things. The tablet did not describe these as treasures or sacred relics. The text called them weapons. Weapons that had been placed underground deliberately. Weapons sealed away by the Anunnaki, the beings the Sumerians described as gods who came down from the heavens. The Anunnaki appear throughout Sumerian literature. These beings created humans, built the first cities, and ruled from their temples. But the tablets also record conflict among the Anunnaki. They did not remain unified. Factions formed, and the factions went to war. When they went to war, they used the 7 weapons. The same weapons named on the clay map. The same weapons that, according to the text, were buried again. Hidden inside a mountain cavity, sealed away and never meant to be disturbed. The account does not exist in a single document. The story is fractured, scattered across tablets found in different cities and written in different centuries. Scholars have spent decades connecting the fragments. When assembled in the correct order, the narrative becomes clear. The 7 weapons were created, used, and then sealed. The map was a record of that sealing. It marked the places where the weapons rested, so that future generations would know where they lay and perhaps avoid them. To understand the 7 weapons, we must first understand the 7 gods who carried them. The Sumerians called this group Iminbi, meaning simply the 7. The Akkadians knew them as the Sabitu. These were not minor deities. They were warrior gods, children of Anu, the sky father, and the earth goddess, Urus. Their power was vast and terrible. They could be marshaled against demons through magical incantations, but they could also be unleashed as agents of destruction. Astronomically, the 7 were identified with the Pleiades star cluster, and their symbol was 7 dots or 7 stars. In the late Babylonian period, a cuneiform text explicitly refers to the 7 weapons of Shamash, the sun god, connecting these divine beings directly to the instruments of war that bear their names. The 7 weapons were seen as ominous signs, a direct link between the heavens and the fate of men. The Sabitu were not just gods. They were weapons personified. Anu, their father, gave each of them a name and a destiny, a task to fulfill in the great war that would tear the world apart. These were not idle gifts. They were commands. They were the very embodiment of the destruction they were meant to cause. As the Era epic, a major source of their story tells us, Anu placed them under the command of Era, the god of plague and destruction, and they became the instruments of his rage. They were a fearsome and fickle force. A treaty from the period appeals to the 7 gods, the warrior gods, requesting them to destroy treaty breakers with their fierce weapons. These 7 gods are the key to the 7 weapons. The weapons, in turn, are the key to understanding the map. The map, as the tablets describe it, shows the location of each weapon sealed away, hidden in the earth. But the weapons are more than just objects. They are the power of the gods made manifest. They are the terrifying potential that the Anunnaki unleashed upon their enemies and then, fearing its use, buried deep within the earth. The first weapon was called the one without rival. It is said that in the era epic, Anu's command to this weapon was to appear on high and proceed without rival. It was the foremost weapon, the primary instrument of terror. There was nothing like it. Nothing could stand against it. It was a weapon of absolute supremacy, meant to dominate any battlefield. Its name reveals its purpose. It was to be unstoppable. When this weapon was unleashed, the enemy had no hope. There was no defense, no countermeasure, no escape. It was the ultimate expression of power, a force that could not be matched by any other weapon in existence. The very sight of it would have been enough to break the spirit of any army. The Anunnaki knew this. They created it to be the final answer to any resistance. And when they used it, they proved that no force in the universe could stand against them. The tablets describe the effect of this weapon in stark terms. It did not simply defeat an enemy. It obliterated the very concept of resistance. Those who witnessed its power were left with no choice but to surrender or perish. The second was the blazing flame. This was a weapon of fire and heat. It was not a simple blaze. It was a force that consumed everything it touched, turning stone to liquid and flesh to ash. The Sumerian text describes it as a weapon of burning that could reduce the world to cinders. The Anunnaki could harness the raw power of the sun. This was the weapon of absolute heat. When it struck, the ground would melt, water would evaporate instantly. The air itself would become unbreathable. Cities would be reduced to pools of molten rock. The survivors would be left with nothing but scorched earth and the memory of unimaginable heat. It was a weapon that left no trace of what had been before. Everything in its path was transformed, consumed, and erased. The heat generated by this weapon was so intense that it could vaporize metal and turn sand into glass. The very ground on which it struck would become a barren, lifeless wasteland. Nothing could grow there. Nothing could live there. The land itself would be scarred for generations. The third weapon was called the one who with terror crumbles. Its true power was psychological. It did not just break walls. It broke the will of those who faced it. It was a weapon of fear, a force that spread dread, causing cities to fall not because their walls were breached, but because their defenders were paralyzed. The weapon targeted the mind and the soul. It attacked the very essence of courage, stripping away the will to fight. Soldiers would drop their weapons and flee. Kings would abandon their thrones. The priests would stop their prayers. It was a weapon that defeated the enemy before a single stone was thrown. The terror it produced was so profound that entire civilizations would surrender without a fight. It was the most efficient weapon of all, because it achieved total victory through the simple act of being seen. The psychological impact of this weapon cannot be overstated. It did not kill, but it destroyed everything worth defending. It left behind a population that was broken, hollow, and incapable of resistance. The fourth was Mountain Melter. This weapon was aimed at the earth itself. It could reduce solid rock to a flowing liquid. Mountains would crack and flow like water. It was a weapon of geological destruction, a force that could reshape the very surface of the planet, making the foundations of the world unsafe. When this weapon was deployed, the landscape would change forever. Rivers would change course. Valleys would become mountains. Mountains would become valleys. It was a weapon that altered the very geography of the earth. The Anunnaki used it to destroy fortresses built into mountainsides, to collapse underground bunkers, and to deny the enemy any safe haven. It was a weapon of absolute transformation, a force that could rewrite the map of the world. The destructive power of this weapon was so immense that entire mountain ranges could be leveled in a matter of moments. The earth itself would groan and shift under the strain. Seismic shocks would ripple across the land, toppling structures and causing widespread devastation far beyond the initial target. The fifth was called wind that seeks the rim of the world. This was not a wind of air. It was a contamination, a cloud of radioactive poison that could travel on the currents of the atmosphere. This wind sought the horizon, the edges of the known world, bringing death and decay to all it touched. It was a weapon of mass contamination. It did not discriminate. It did not stop at borders. It traveled wherever the wind took it, spreading sickness and death across entire regions. Crops would wither, animals would die, people would fall ill and perish. The land would become uninhabitable for generations. It was a weapon that poisoned everything in its path, leaving a trail of destruction that could not be cleaned or healed. It was the most insidious of the 7 weapons, because its effects lingered long after the initial blast. The contamination would seep into the soil, into the water, into the very air that people breathed. It was a slow, agonizing death that spread over weeks, months, and even years. The 6th was named the one who above and below, no one spares. It was absolute. It made no distinction. The heavens and the underworld, the gods and the mortals, nothing was beyond its reach. It was a weapon of finality, an instrument of total annihilation. It was the judgment that could not be appealed. When this weapon was used, there was no escape. No cave was deep enough. No fortress was strong enough. No prayer was powerful enough. It struck everything, everywhere, without mercy or exception. It was the weapon that ended wars by ending everything. The Anunnaki used it only when they had no other choice, because they knew that once this weapon was unleashed, there would be nothing left to fight for. The totality of its destruction was absolute. It left no survivors, no witnesses, no evidence of what had been there before. It was the ultimate weapon of erasure. The 7th was the most terrible of all. It was vaporizer of living things. It was filled with monstrous venom. This weapon caused death to the life-giving soul. This was the end of all life. This weapon extinguished the very spark of existence. It was the ultimate solution, a force that could end a civilization, a species, or a world. When this weapon struck, living things simply ceased to exist. Not killed, not destroyed, vaporized. There was nothing left. No body, no trace, no evidence. It was a weapon that erased life from the face of the earth. It was the most feared of all the 7, because it offered no hope of survival. It was the final answer to any question of power. The tablets describe the aftermath of this weapon as a void, a place where nothing lived and nothing could ever live again. These are the 7. These are the forces that the Anunnaki named and used. These are the horrors that the map shows, sealed beneath the earth. For those who wish to follow this to its end, stay with us. The 7 names mean nothing without their story. That story begins with the Anunnaki themselves. The Anunnaki were not merely gods in a pantheon. They were a race. They were beings from the sky, a people who came to Earth and established a colony. They built cities. They created humanity. They were our creators. But they were also deeply flawed. They were not wise and benevolent gods. They were powerful, ambitious, and prone to conflict. The tablets describe a society with a ruling class, a council, and a hierarchy. There was a king, Anu. There was a commander, Enlil. There was a scientist and creator, Enki. And there were countless others, lesser gods who served and managed the affairs of the earth. Each of these beings had their own domain, their own responsibilities, and their own ambitions. They were not a unified group. They were a society with all the politics, jealousy, and rivalry that societies produce. For millennia, the Anunnaki ruled. They managed their colony, and they were at peace. They extracted resources from the earth. They built grand structures. They created a workforce of humans to serve them. They were the masters of the world, and they had no rivals. But power breeds jealousy. It breeds ambition. The peace was not to last. The conflict erupted over control. The Earth's resources, particularly its gold, were essential to the Anunnaki's own survival, as they needed it to repair their planet's atmosphere. This created a division. A faction wanted to keep the power for themselves. Another wanted to share the wealth, or perhaps redistribute it. The lines were drawn. The factions formed. They went to war. The war was not fought with mere spears and arrows. It was a technological conflict. The Anunnaki had weapons of immense destructive power. They had the 7 weapons. They also had other terrifying instruments of war. The god Ninurta wielded a weapon called the Imdugud, which is described as a floodstorm of battle. Another was the Shita weapon, which plucks out hearts. The Lugal-E myth describes Ninurta's war against the forces of the mountain, where these weapons are used to smite his enemies. The divine weapons were personified, not just as objects, but as servants. They could fly and act on their own initiative. They were, in every sense, intelligent weapons. It is a terrifying image, a weapon that thinks, that has a will of its own. These weapons were not simply tools, they were extensions of the gods themselves, imbued with their power and their purpose. The war escalated. The Anunnaki used the 7 weapons. They targeted their own cities, their own spaceports, their own infrastructure. According to the texts, the final conflict was the absolute worst. It was a nuclear war. This is not just speculation. The Sumerian texts describe a final, cataclysmic battle where the 7 weapons were used without restraint. They obliterated the ancient spaceport. They destroyed the vital control centers. They scorched the earth. The text describes a cavity inside the earth. The weapons were used, but the war was not a victory for anyone. The destruction was so absolute that even the Anunnaki themselves were horrified. The use of the weapons backfired. The radioactive cloud spread northeastward, irradiating Mesopotamia, the Lebanon, and the Sinai. The Anunnaki's own civilization was destroyed. They were forced to accept that the war had cost them everything. This is where the map comes in. The weapons were so devastating that they could not be allowed to be used again. The Anunnaki, fearing their own creation, decided to seal them away. The weapons were collected and hidden. They were placed deep inside a mountain, in a cavity, sealed underground where they would never be found. The knowledge of their location was kept secret. It was a secret so profound that even the gods themselves were not fully trusted. Enlil kept the secret. He knew the hiding place, but he did not share it freely. He waited until the time was right, until he had chosen the right heroes. He gave the secret to one of his own sons and to one of Enki's. He sent them to retrieve the weapons from their slumber, but he gave them a warning. He said, "Ere the weapons are used, by the Anunnaki must the chariot's place be vacated. The cities must be spared. The people must not perish." It was an order, a final plea to use restraint. But it came too late. The weapons were already used. The damage was already done. The map was a record. The map was a warning. It shows where they lie. It shows the places where the gods hid their weapons. It is a testament to a war that nearly destroyed the world. It is a testament to a power that must never be used again. The aftermath of the war was devastating. The land was poisoned. The survivors, both Anunnaki and human, were left to pick up the pieces. The cities lay in ruins. The temples were empty. The gods had abandoned their thrones. The great civilization that had once ruled the earth was reduced to scattered remnants. The Anunnaki, once powerful and proud, were now humbled. They had destroyed themselves with their own weapons. The survivors lived in fear of another conflict. They knew that the weapons still existed, sealed away, waiting. The map was created to ensure that no one would ever find them again. But the weapons themselves survived. They were not destroyed. They were sealed, hidden, placed underground where they could not be reached. The map was created to ensure that no one would accidentally stumble upon them. It was a warning to future generations. Do not dig here. Do not disturb what lies beneath. The Anunnaki wanted to make sure that the weapons would never be found, never be used, never bring about such destruction again. The question remains, did they succeed? The map exists. The tablets exist. The story exists. And somewhere beneath the earth, the weapons still lie. The map shows where. It marks the 7 locations. It names the weapons. It records the warning. Scholars and researchers continue to study the tablets. They continue to translate the cuneiform. They continue to piece together the fragments of the story. And they continue to wonder, is it true? Did the Anunnaki really seal 7 weapons of immense power beneath the earth? Did they really fight a war that nearly destroyed the world? Is the map real? The evidence suggests that something happened. The blackened scar on the Sinai Peninsula is real. It is a vast area of scorched rock that does not look like any natural formation. The vitrified brickwork at Borsippa is real. Bricks that appear to have been melted by intense heat turned to glass. This is not the kind of damage caused by a simple fire. It requires temperatures that only a nuclear explosion or a weapon of similar power could produce. The Libyan desert glass is real. A vast field of glass sheets covering hundreds of square kilometers. It is formed by intense heat, far beyond what any ordinary fire could generate. These are physical marks on the earth that cannot be easily explained. They are anomalies, remnants of something terrible that occurred in the distant past. There is also the evidence of the tablets themselves. The Sumerians were meticulous record keepers. They wrote down everything. They recorded their history, their religion, their daily lives. They wrote about the Anunnaki. They wrote about the weapons. They wrote about the war. And they wrote about the map. This is not a story from a single source. It is a story that appears in multiple texts across multiple centuries, in multiple cities. The consistency of the account is striking. The narrative is clear. The Anunnaki came from the heavens. They ruled the earth. They created humanity. They fought among themselves. They used terrible weapons. They sealed those weapons underground. They created a map to mark the locations. And then, they faded from history, leaving behind only the tablets and the map. For those who have stayed with us through this telling, the path ends here. The 7 weapons have been named. Their purpose has been explained. The evidence has been presented. What remains is the quiet understanding that some stories are more than stories. Some maps are more than maps. Some warnings are meant to be heard. The clay tablets rest in museums. The words are carved in stone. The weapons sleep beneath the earth. And the map, if it is real, still shows the way, but perhaps it is better not to look. Perhaps the Anunnaki sealed the weapons for a reason. Perhaps the warning was meant to be heeded. The map shows where they lie, but it does not tell us to dig. It tells us to remember. It tells us to stay away. It tells us that some things are better left buried. The 7 weapons remain underground. The map shows their resting places. The Anunnaki sealed them away, and the earth keeps their secret, as it has for thousands of years. The story, however, continues to be told. The tablets continue to be read. The map continues to be studied. And somewhere beneath the desert sands, the 7 weapons still wait, sealed away, undisturbed, forgotten by all but those who know where to look.